Well, the White House on the defensive today over a story that ran in the Washington Post claiming the Obama administration received plenty of warning about the growing humanitarian crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. Plenty of warning as early as last summer, but failed to act. The story had many sources, but cited in part a report that raised serious flags about the flood of unaccompanied children across the border and warned that the situation was expected to get a lot worse. The White House dismissed the story as giving too much weight to anonymous sources. Like this one. Here's an example of an anonymous source quoted in the Washington Post. There were warning signs, operational folks raising red flags to high levels in terms of this being a potential issue. Again, that's just one quote in a longer piece, but it was the focus of some serious pushback from the White House press secretary Josh Earnest. Take a listen.
First, point out that you're asking about a story that's based entirely on anonymous sources, so that should be reflected in the record. The second is, if you do take a look at what this administration's response has been, not just in the last couple of months, but over the last few years, you've seen that this administration has repeatedly sought additional resources to deal with this specific problem at the border.
David Nakamura is the White House correspondent for the Washington Post and serves as a lead writer on the article in question. So, David, we're certainly going to talk about your article. Several pages long, we should mention. It's not a short one for the viewers that may have missed it. But what's your reaction to what the White House had to say about your work?
Jen, I think it's a time-honored tradition in situations like this where if the government is unhappy with sort of the findings, they're not able to pick apart the findings and the conclusions of the articles, maybe they go after the process. And I think that's what happened yesterday. There was frustration by Josh Earnest. You know, this is an exhaustively researched report by myself, two colleagues. We spent several weeks on this. I think if you go, and people can go to WashingtonPost.com, find the article. There are 10 people quoted on the record, including a congresswoman, the First Lady of Guatemala, the head of the ICE Union of Catholic Bishop, 3 administration officials, and the former patrol station chief who worked as a consultant on this very issue last year for the government and put together that report. So there's a number of sources in this and a number of reports which we talked about in the story, as well as internal documents. This is not entirely based on anonymous sources. Very little is based on anonymous sources.
So I feel you're taking it a little bit as a compliment that Josh Earnest is going that direction.
I think so, right? I think if he had had a flaw with some of the reporting or some of the findings, he would have addressed that. That wasn't really addressed yesterday.
Fair point made. So for our viewers that may have missed the article, I'm sure they're going to go back and check it out. The crux of it is what? What did the administration know and when about the border crisis?
Well, this issue really kind of burst into headlines in May. I think, some reporters were already working on stories about the crisis on the border, but what it really drove it, of course, was the administration acknowledging that it had reached a crisis proportion at the end of May. The Homeland Security Secretary saw it on a Mother's Day trip, and the president around June 1st ordered a wide government response and now wants almost $4 billion to deal with it. But what we looked at was this has been a crisis. If you look at the numbers by Border Control, this has been a problem for now 2.5 years before this became a big issue at the White House. And so we wanted to look at the record, and there's a lot of it to look at, as to what big markers there were for this administration to maybe have mounted this response earlier. And that's what we did last year. Like I mentioned, they had hired an outside consultant at the Department of Homeland Security for $100,000. A guy used to work in Border Patrol, and they did a study last summer, already seeing this phenomenon at the Border Patrol stations where the agents were very frustrated. They were dealing with lots of children unaccompanied. They had to sort of go shopping for groceries, take them to showers off site. And provide video games to play as they were trying to figure out what to do with the kids. So there's a number of markers along the way. The Catholic bishops went to Central America last November and delivered a report to the administration where the White House probably should have been able to recognize this and really just didn't bring it into the public scope and didn't mount that full-fledged response.
And let's talk a little bit about that. One of the things you write in your piece is that the administration did too little to heed those warnings, according to interviews with former government officials, outside experts, and immigrant advocates. And this is what you go on to write, leading to an inadequate response that contributed to this summer's escalating crisis. The big question that we're trying to get at, David, is why? Why, after all of this attention and obviously a lot of reports going back to Washington, why was there so little action to try to deal with the problem?
I think, Jenna, there was a number of things. First, they were a little bit slow to recognize it despite some of these big markers. There was a broader flood of immigrants from Central America, including adults, coming into the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. That had been a shift from previous migration patterns to Arizona. So there was a broader migration coming in, illegal migration, and the children were a smaller piece. But I think the other question that we tried to answer in the story were the White House, the administration, and congressional Democrats concerned that if they raised too big a public outcry to sort of address this problem directly, that would go against the idea that the president was pushing for broader immigration reform, saying that the border was secure and now we need to move forward to sort of maybe provide legal status for undocumented immigrants who've lived in the U.S. for a long time.
So they were worried that if they took action, that politically it could be a problem for them on this larger legislation.
It could give weight to Republican arguments that the border is not secure. And you're seeing that now, of course. That is a debate going on in the Hill over the president's funding requests. The Republicans are saying we're not sure about the border. Yesterday, Texas Governor Rick Perry ordered 1,000 National Guard troops to the border because he said he's not convinced the administration is doing enough and they're distracted by this crisis. So over time, the budget to try to deal with this problem was growing, but Democrats on the Hill told me there was talk that they were concerned that if they made too big of a public issue of this earlier on, that could have harmed the efforts of immigration reform. The administration says that's not true, but it does look like they were caught flat-footed. And I think even they acknowledge that the numbers swelled this year to numbers well above what they expected,
right.
And now they're trying to sort of do catch-up.
Well, it's a fascinating piece. We'll make sure that our viewers have access to it as well, David, and we appreciate the time. Please let us know if you and Josh Earnest are able to go out for a couple drinks and figure things out.
I'm not sure that's happening anytime soon, Jenna.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. David, great to see you. Look forward to having you back. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.